Excuse me? You gotta be kidding me.
I got a job, I work 40 hours a week. And it kept me busy.
I'm sorry, I've been waiting for 20 minutes. I can't be late for work. Thank you.
Oh, hey, excuse me. Hey, excuse me. Hey, you dropped this.
Oh, thank you. I didn't even notice.
Yeah, I know, you seem like you're in a hurry.
Yeah, I'm late for work. I got a new job. I don't want to be late.
I'm Joby, by the way.
Tracy.
Tracy, it's nice to meet you. Well, listen, I know you're in a hurry, but I'd really like to take you to coffee or get a beer sometime.
Okay.
Yeah?
Yeah, I'd like that.
Great.
Sure. I don't have any paper, but
Okay.
this will work.
I thought he was very handsome, charming, very polite. Seemed like he had stuff together. So we exchanged numbers.
All right. I'll give you a call.
Okay.
All right. Bye.
Joby wastes no time reaching out to Tracy.
Okay, good.
And right away, the two seem to hit it off.
All right, you're up.
Okay.
Let's see what you got.
I warned you. I'm terrible at this.
All right, well, you'll get another turn, so be better next time.
I didn't date a whole lot of guys before him, so he's basically my second relationship.
Sure.
I met his mother and all. We seemed to came from a really good home and everything. He liked doing stuff, everything from bowling to shooting pool to jet skiing to playing cards, games, putt-putt. Yeah, we did a lot.
Go for it. That's way better.
You're just being nice.
No, you're natural. It's good.
Tracy and Joby fall hard for each other. And just a few months later, they get a place together in Baltimore County's Bowley's Quarters neighborhood.
Okay. All right. Is that it?
I think there's one more in the car.
Okay. All right, I'm on my way.
Okay.
Right.
Thank you.
You got it.
We moved in together pretty quick. He always pampered me with gifts, stuff like that. He bought me a $2,000 diamond ring. He sent me flowers to work all the time, just for no reason at all. I wasn't used to stuff like that, but I loved it.
Just when everything seems to be going right for Tracy, signs of trouble start to appear.
You still need me to come in early for you tomorrow?
Yeah, if you don't mind, I'd really appreciate it.
Yeah, I can do that.
Awesome. Well, I'll see you tomorrow. Is that your boyfriend?
Joby, what are you doing here?
What the hell's going on? You trying to steal my girl?
Joby, please, we work together. We stop together.
Shut up. You got the wrong idea, man. You better stay away from her.
Joby.
Hear me? Stay away from her.
Ow, Joby.
He was a very jealous person. I never really understood that because, he was a nice-looking guy, I thought, and he had a lot going for him, and I'm like, I don't know what he was so jealous about.
Joby.
Get in the car.
Joby.
Get in.
Ow.
And admit it, you want him.
No. I don't, I swear.
It was ever nothing. You know what I mean? Just because he was insecure about himself or thought I was looking at somebody. I was like, when Joby wasn't happy, it was like nobody else could be happy. If he was in a bad mood, then forget it.
I better not see you with him ever again.
No, thanks.
about earlier, that could have been avoided. Okay, you know how crazy I get when I think about you with another guy.
I wasn't with another guy. Neil and I worked together. We were just leaving work at the same time. And you really hurt my arm.
I know, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have done that.
Maybe we're taking this too fast. Maybe we shouldn't have moved in together.
No, don't say that. I need you, babe. Okay?
I know.
With her relationship with Joby getting more complicated, Tracy pours herself into her new job with positive results.
I was working at the Eugene's. It's just kind of like a dollar store type place right down the street.
George and I have noticed how hard you've been working. We're very proud to have you.
Thanks, Gloria. I've been trying really hard to do my best.
As you know, we're looking for a new shift supervisor. And I know you're relatively new, but I think you'd be a great fit.
Really? You want me to do it?
Mm-hmm. And it'd be a pretty good bump in pay. So if you're interested, the job is yours.
Yes, absolutely.
She just took a liking to me. I only was working there for a couple months, and she made me assistant manager over top of people that have been there longer. Great people, wonderful. I love both of them, her and her husband.
But not everyone is excited about Tracy's big promotion.
Joby, you scared me.
I scared you? It's past midnight. Where the hell have you been dressed like that?
What? What do you mean? What's wrong with my dress?
You look like you're asking for it. Walking around dressed like that. Are you looking for an easy lay?
Screw you.
I asked you a question. Where the hell have you been?
Gloria took me to dinner because of the promotion, and some of the other girls wanted to go get drinks.
Some of the other girls? No guys, just girls.
Neil went for a little while, but he's partly...
You're sleeping with him, aren't you?
No.
Aren't you? That's why you got your promotion.
No, that's ridiculous.
That's ridiculous. Are you saying I'm crazy? Huh?
No.
Or what? You just think you're better than me? Is that it?
No.
Don't you forget that you are nothing but a cheap slut from the gutter. You are nothing without me.
Stop it.
God help you. If I ever catch you cheating on me, Tracy, I mean it. I will kill you.
After seeing a violent side of her live-in boyfriend, Joby Pelzinski, 22-year-old Tracy Whitehead is convinced it's time to move out.
He would just have episodes. I think it was the way he was feeling about himself or something, so he kind of took it out on me, you know what I mean? It just kept going on and on and on. It just was getting worse, and I just like, yeah, it's time to move on. I saved up all my money and got a place, but they had to paint and lay carpet before I could move in.
Just when Tracy thinks she has everything under control, some cracks in her plan start to shine through.
Hey, Tracy, hang on just a second. I'll call you back. Bye. I forgot something. Oh my God. Joby?
Yeah, it's fine.
You have got to call the police. You've got to get away from him. I'm telling you, these guys, they do not stop. It only gets worse.
My boss, Gloria, she had went through an abusive relationship. And see, that's right there is where she had that bond with me where she could understand because she had went through it herself.
I know, but I found an apartment, my own apartment. It won't be ready for a week.
No, you can't go back to him now. You've got to get away from him immediately.
How? He's not gonna let me leave.
Where is he right now? Where's Joby?
At work?
Take my keys. Go get packed. I'll meet you at my place in 2 hours.
What about my shift?
Don't worry about it. Just go. Please go.
I just got to the point where I didn't want to be scared anymore. I just wanted to move on from him. You know, I couldn't stay stuck like that forever. The phone rang at my house, and nobody was supposed to be home. So I was like really nervous, like, why is my phone ringing? Packing my stuff up, and all I could hear was his voice, and I was just shaking.
You need to get out of there right now. Joby just left here.
Okay, I'm going.
911, what's your emergency?
Yes, I need to report a domestic abuse situation. You need to send an officer right away.
I knew he was gonna be there in like 2 seconds. He's gonna catch me.
Tracy! Tracy! You ungrateful bitch! Get in! Get in here! After everything that I've done for you, you think you're leaving me? You are never leaving me. Never. Don't think about it.
Joby, please don't hurt me. Please. I'm sorry.
Police, open up. Did you call the cops?
No.
You sit there and shut your mouth.
Hello, officer. Can I help you?
We received a call about a domestic disturbance.
No, everything's good here.
Please help me! He's gonna kill me!
Sir, step back. Put your hands on your head. Turn around. Slowly.
At that point, she had had enough of his controlling her and assaulting her. And so she went to file charges.
At the police station, Tracy makes a shocking realization. She's not the first girl to file assault charges against Joby Palczynski.
There were multiple prior cases of domestic abuse. And in each case of the 4 prior cases, there was assault, there was abuse, and the women tried to get away from him. And then 2 years later, he was deemed to be okay and back on the street.
Tracy leaves that night, confident she's made the right choice.
I'm at work the next day, and here comes his mom into my job. She said, Tracy, he really ain't doing too good.
Look, you can't press charges against him. Another conviction and they'll lock him up for years.
Good. He needs to be locked up so he doesn't kill someone.
Honey, it's not his fault. He just gets in those moods sometimes. He's really a good boy. You need to go back and tell the officers it was all a mistake.
I can't do that. He knew exactly what he was doing.
His mom asked me if I would lie and say that I made the whole thing up, that he didn't hit me. I said, I have no sympathy for him no more. I was tired, I was done with it, I said no.
In the next few days, Tracy does her best to put the incident behind her. Convinced, Joby's now safely behind bars.
Okay, enjoy.
With her apartment still days away from completion, Tracy continues to enjoy the hospitality of her co-worker Gloria and husband George Shank.
You have to try her spaghetti and meatballs.
Well, that's his favorite.
I know you're in there, Tracy. Open the door.
Oh my God. Oh my God. He's out already?
Tracy Whitehead's violent ex-boyfriend is back.
Tracy had taken a protective order out against him and I believe charged him with assault. He was released on $7,500 bail.
We need to call the police.
What good will that do? They'll come arrest him, but obviously let him out again.
Tracy, don't you dare open that door.
I can't hide in here forever.
Tracy.
He almost killed me. I was shocked when he got out of jail. He should have never got bail. No way.
Tracy, listen to me. I'm sorry, okay? I promise that's not ever gonna happen again, okay? Just come home, right? I need you. Just come home.
No, Joby, I can't.
He was like, I don't care that you got me locked up. I'm not mad at you. I won't be mad at you for getting me locked up, I promise. You know, he was like, please, just give me another chance. I was like, no, don't talk to me.
I'm not gonna do that again. That's not gonna happen, I promise.
You need to go.
Okay, you go get your things. You're coming with me. Come on, let's go.
I got this, Tracy. You heard it. You need to leave now.
That's my girlfriend. I don't take orders from you.
Well, you're taking him tonight, and I'm not getting out of your face. I want you off my property or I'm calling the cops. Go. Go now.
You're gonna regret this. This is not over.
He wanted her back. He was very controlling in that manner, and he claims that he loved her to the point that he just could not let her go.
The next few days, life seems to return to normal, but Tracy still finds it difficult to relax.
Jeez. Oh, you scared me.
I'm sorry. I heard a noise.
No, I'm sorry. I was just using the bathroom. Hey, why don't you let me hold on to that? And if anyone tries to break into this house, I will take care of them. I promise.
It's okay with you. I think I'd like to hang on to it.
Of course. I completely understand. Try and get some sleep, dear.
Good night.
Good night.
I kept going to the doors, locking on the doors. That's how nervous of a wreck that, you know, how scared I was. Gloria's like, Tracy, you'll be okay. Don't worry about it. Nothing's gonna happen.
4 days after pressing charges against Joby, Tracy is finally getting into a routine with Gloria and George Shank.
Take care of it then.
Sure.
Joby, no!
Joby just opened the door, came in there unannounced. When Tracy saw him, she was pretty much petrified.
Get out of my house!
Hang up the phone.
Joby, please. Please stop.
I said hang up the phone now!
I remember she stood up. She said, "Get out of my house." And he shot her.
No! Corey!
Everything happened so fast.
What are you doing?
What the hell's going on in here? Whoa, please, okay? Just stop, okay?
Joby!
Please.
Then he shot him. I went in a total shot. I hit the ground and started crawling.
Keep going. You get back here. Get up. Get up. I told you that you weren't leaving me, and now look at what you made me do. You made me do this.
You're crazy.
I told you not to call me that.
Please don't.
We're going for a ride.
No. Wait.
Come on. You find out.
I felt like I was just in I don't know, like a twilight zone. It just was so, it wasn't real, you know, it was just so surreal. I said to him, why? Why did you have to kill anybody? I said, you're done for good now. You're going to jail forever. Well, he didn't want to go to jail, that was the thing. You know, he'd rather been dead to go to jail.
Shut your mouth. I'll kill you right here.
As he's dragging her from the home to the vehicle that he came there in, a neighbor, David Myers, heard the screaming, her screaming for help, and he came around to help.
Help me!
Hey, what's going on?
And he shot him right away. That hurt. It did.
After that, he put her into the car that he was driving in, and he didn't know where to go. He wanted to get away from the scene.
Joby soon comes to a rural and secluded section of Baltimore County. There, he abandons his vehicle and sets out with Tracy on foot.
They ended up in a dense wooded area, and he's very angered at her at that point, threatening to kill her.
Joby, please. Please don't do this.
Shut up!
I felt like I was just numb.
Joby.
Keep moving.
And I actually asked him, before you kill me, can you please let me call my son and tell him that I love him, or write him a letter or something? That's all I really was worried about at the time.
Joby, please, my son.
I don't care about your son. Just walk.
Joby, please. Joby, please.
Let's stop. Well, I guess this is as good a place as any. Get on your knees.
Joby, please. Please don't do that.
Please, at least let me call my son so I can say goodbye.
Tracy Whitehead has just watched her ex-boyfriend shoot and kill 3 people. Now, she fears that she will be next.
I just felt like I was going to die. So I might as well just close my eyes and, you know, wait for it. And I said, whatever happens, happens. He's going to kill me.
But turns out that's not what Joby Palczynski has in mind.
It's just like old times. This is all I really wanted, for the two of us to be together. I'm gonna marry you, Tracy. And we're gonna spend the rest of our lives together.
He had sex with me. You might say raped me because I wasn't trying to have sex with him. I just laid there, and I don't know how he could even wanted to have sex after all that happened. He just killed people.
It's a long night in the woods. But the next morning, Tracy is surprised to find she's still alive.
When we was in the woods, he had laid the guns down a couple times. You don't know how bad I want to pick that gun up and shoot him.
Meanwhile, news of the triple homicide back in Bowley's quarters has quickly spread, and a countywide manhunt is now in full force.
We learned who the person was, that being Joseph Palczynski, and began looking for him. We were using helicopters, ground searches. Over 100 officers were called in to do the various searches, so it was a very large-scale operation.
Everybody was looking for this guy, and he was very elusive. He had learned how to do things to avoid detection and to survive when, in the woods and that kind of thing.
Joby holds Tracy captive another full day in the woods, which takes a toll on Tracy emotionally and also physically.
Joby, I'm tired.
No.
I need a bed.
I know.
After 2 days in the woods, he wanted to hear some type of news. Because we ain't heard nothing about what was being said. So I talked him into going to the motel.
We're close to the road. We're just gonna need another car.
Joby steals a car and drives to a seedy motel in Baltimore County.
Once we got there, I was like, I don't know if this is a good idea. I felt like I barricaded myself into somewhere where I was going to be trapped. I was saying all kinds of stuff.
Don't get any ideas about running off. Do you understand?
Not going anywhere.
Damn right. You're damn right you're not going anywhere. You're mine. If I go down, you're going with me.
But as they settle into the motel, there is one silver lining for Tracy.
He couldn't carry the guns into the motel, so he had to leave them in the trunk. So it was the first time he didn't have the guns.
While they're in the room, he turns on the television set, and of course the news media is broadcasting about everything that is going on.
Damn. My pictures everywhere. We can't stay here, they'll find us.
And all of a sudden he was like, we gotta get out of here, this is suicide. Why'd I come in here?
I am not getting caught in here unarmed. I am not going back to prison. I will take down all those cops with me before I let them take us. Come on.
Said as soon as the cops come, he was gonna do suicide by the police, basically. He was gonna shoot me first, shoot at them and let them kill him. So I'm like, oh my God, I don't know how I'm gonna get out of this situation because if the cops find us, I'm dead. How am I gonna get out of this?
He takes Tracy and they go outside to get the weapons out of the vehicle, at which point she sees a police car on an unrelated incident.
After days of being held hostage, Tracy finally sees her chance to escape.
Tracy, no!
I didn't even think, I just ran because I was thinking I'm gonna die either way. I better make a run for it now while he ain't got these guns on him. So I ran to the cop car.
She runs to the police officer screaming for help. That's when Joseph Palczynski fled the area.
My name is Tracy Whitehead. I was kidnapped by my boyfriend.
Who's your boyfriend?
His name's Joby Palczynski. He's over there. He's got guns in the town. Please help
Dispatch, we have a 1033 requesting backup. Now tell me what
My heart was beating so fast. I kept saying, please just get me out of here. I was still scared he was gonna come back.
Dispatch, potential suspect is Joe Papasinski. I'm requesting immediate backup.
I couldn't believe I was alive. But all the people's lives that he took, you know, and then here I'm alive. And I'm like thinking, why am I alive? I should have died.
Tracy, I know this is a difficult time for you. We've got 100% of our department's resources dedicated to finding Joby, but we're still gonna need your help.
Even though we're conducting large-scale manhunts looking for him, we didn't know his whereabouts at all. But we felt he wanted Tracy. That was his ultimate goal. And he did not have her.
Can you think of any place at all he might be going?
No.
They said they were putting me in police custody. And I was like, oh, well, thank God, because I want to be in police custody. That was much better. I had police around the clock.
Okay. Listen, we're gonna keep you safe, all right? Try to get some rest. If you think of anything else, anything at all that might help us, just let me know. All right.
She was able to escape, which further put the pressure on to try to find this guy, because that certainly wasn't going to mitigate his kind of state of mind. He was obsessed with her, and clearly was not stopping at anything to get her. He wasn't afraid to shoot. He wasn't afraid to kill.
9 days after Tracy Whitehead is taken into police custody, her mom, Lynn Whitehead, is just settling in for the night.
Joby! Where is she? Tell me where she is! Please don't shoot!
For 9 days, Tracy Whitehead has been living under constant police protection, unaware that her violent ex-boyfriend Joby Palzinski has forced his way into her mother's house, weapon drawn.
Where is she?
She's not
I'm
here!
not playing games. You tell me where she is.
She's not here, Joby, I swear! Tracy is not here, please don't!
His motivation was Tracy. He was obsessed with Tracy.
Someone better bring Tracy to me now, or I'm gonna kill everybody!
7825, code 6, 105 North Avenue, 52.
We received a 911 call from Lynn, who says, Joseph Palzinski's here. He has his weapons. He's threatening to kill us, and he wants to talk to Tracy.
Police immediately head for Tracy's mom's house.
Our tactical division was looking at what we could possibly do to come to an end to this. He said he'd turn himself into the federal government. So we made arrangements with the FBI for him to turn himself into them. As soon as we did it, then he backed down. He wasn't coming out. He didn't want to go back to jail. He wanted Tracy back. That was all he could envision.
The standoff drags on for days, and police know they can no longer keep Tracy in the dark.
Can I go home now?
I wish you could.
Oh, can I at least make a phone call?
Maybe later. Why don't you have a seat? There's something I have to tell you. We really can't keep this from you anymore. Frankly, Tracy, we're gonna need your help, okay? I want you to stay calm, but this is about your mother.
What did he do to her?
I just started busting out crying. He's gonna kill my mom.
What did he do?
They said he kept saying that he wants to talk to me and he would let them go. But I told them, I said, if he gets me on that phone, he's gonna shoot my mother. So I could hear it.
4 days go by with the entire community held in fear by this crazed gunman. Through it all, police work tirelessly.
The streets were blocked off because he was firing a high-powered weapon out the window towards the police. We didn't want civilians hurt. It became a real safety factor for the community.
So on that Tuesday, which is now the 4th day, we saw the FBI bring in its hostage rescue team. You could just tell that that day, that Tuesday, that the mood of the cops had changed. There was much more of kind of an anticipation going on.
Inside the house, Tracy's mom, Lynn Whitehead, is also desperate for something to give. Finally, she decides to take matters into her own hands.
Bulldozers rumbled into this refugee camp earlier Wednesday, razing or heavily damaging 30 homes, triggering an exchange of fire. They killed 10 Palestinians, more than a dozen. About a dozen downtown businesses were boarded up Wednesday, and glass littered the sidewalks following 2 nights of protests over the shooting of an unarmed black man. And police urged curiosity seekers to stay out of the over-the-Rhine neighborhood. Technology stocks extended their gain Wednesday and did positive news on several fronts, but most fell victim to a sell-off after a two-session rally.
Here you go.
The Dow Industrial and South. The European Central Bank on Wednesday kept interest rates unchanged, resisting pressure to join other major central banks and help stimulate the slow Eurozone economy with the country. Faced with slowing demand for wireless
Lynn spiked the glass of his iced tea with Xanax, and he ended up falling asleep on the sofa in the living room.
97 hours after first being taken hostage inside her home, Tracy's mother, Lynn Whitehead, finally sees her way out.
That's when she escaped. We knew that we had to take action rapidly. If Palzinski wakes up, it would be a possible deadly situation. We had the tactical team go to the front door. The door was breached.
That's when Palzinski wakes up and immediately threatens police.
The tactical officers felt their lives were in danger. They responded.
It was almost surreal the way it happened. There was no way this was going to end with Joseph Palzinski giving himself up. There was no way. Not that guy. So the fact that it ended with him getting shot 27 times by a SWAT team, that's the way that was going to end.
After more than 2 weeks of life or death tension, Tracy Whitehead is finally safe. Still, she doesn't come out of the situation unharmed.
People were telling me, don't feel like this is your fault, because you was a victim too. But I did feel bad because I was alive. I had a lot of guilt about that.
It's taken years, but Tracy eventually finds the strength to move on.
I wish that when I first started seeing the abusive side of him, I would have just left then and just never had nothing to do with him ever again. You know what I mean? Instead of being in love and thinking I can change somebody.
A survivor through and through, she says that it's her children that keep her going through her darkest days.
My kids, they are the ones that make me happy. This world's so crazy, you know? I don't want to live in fear, being paranoid or anything like that. I thought I was dead. When you watch somebody kill that many people or even kill one person, of course, I mean, you're thinking you're next. Because the whole thing was basically to come kill me. So, well, it didn't work. He didn't get to do that. I'm a survivor.
There are murders that disappear into history, And then there are murders that refuse to disappear. For 37 years, one question haunted a Florida family. Who killed Teresa Lee Scalf? She was 29 years old, a registered nurse, a mother, a daughter, a sister, a woman who went to work, cared for patients, raised her young son, and lived an ordinary life in Lakeland, Florida. Then, on the afternoon of October 27, 1986, that ordinary life ended inside her own home. When investigators arrived, they found a crime scene so violent that the case immediately became one of the most disturbing unsolved murders in Polk County. Teresa had been attacked. She had suffered severe wounds to her neck. Her hands showed significant defensive injuries, evidence that she had fought for her life. Investigators determined that the assault was sexually motivated. And somewhere inside that house, the killer made one mistake. He left blood behind. At the time, that blood was almost useless. It could be collected. It could be preserved. It could be tested. But it could not yet tell detectives whose blood it was. That single biological trace would sit in evidence for decades. 30 years passed. Then another year. Then another. The suspect did not appear in a criminal database. No fingerprints suddenly solved the case. No witness came forward with a confession. No mysterious letter arrived. The killer simply vanished into the passage of time. But the blood remained. And eventually, science caught up with it. Teresa's murder began in a quiet Florida neighborhood, the kind of place where people recognized the cars parked outside their homes and knew which neighbor worked nights and which neighbor left for work early in the morning. Teresa lived there with her 8-year-old son. She worked as a nurse at what was then Lakeland General Hospital, now Lakeland Regional Health Medical Center. Her profession was built around helping people. She was trusted with patients when they were at their most vulnerable. Her family remembered her as someone who cared deeply about others. Nothing about her life suggested that she would become the center of one of Polk County's most enduring homicide investigations. On October 27th, Teresa did not show up for work. That was unusual. Her absence immediately raised concern. Her mother, Betty Scalf, went to check on her daughter. What she found changed the family forever. Teresa was dead inside her home. The woman who had spent her life caring for others had become the victim of a brutal attack. The scene told detectives this was not an accident. This was violence. And the killer had apparently been close enough to Teresa to enter her home. The question was how? Why Teresa? Why that afternoon? And who could have gotten close to her without immediately raising suspicion? Detectives began the work that investigators always begin in a homicide. They reconstructed the victim's final hours. They spoke with neighbors. They checked the area. They looked for anyone who had seen something unusual. They searched for motive. They looked for personal connections. They examined physical evidence. And they searched for a suspect. But there was a problem. There was no obvious suspect. The neighborhood canvas produced conversations, names, and possibilities, but nothing that pointed decisively toward one person. Among the people investigators spoke with was a man named Donald Douglas. He lived directly behind Teresa. At the time, there was nothing in his background that made him stand out as a murderer. Douglas had no criminal history. He had not built a reputation as a violent man. There was no obvious reason for detectives to place him at the center of the investigation. So he was interviewed as part of the routine neighborhood canvass. Then he went home. The investigation continued without him. That decision would become one of the most haunting details of the case. Because almost 4 decades later, investigators would identify Douglas as the man responsible for Teresa's murder. But in 1986, there was no way to know that. There was no genetic genealogy. There were no massive consumer DNA databases capable of connecting an unknown crime scene sample to distant relatives. The forensic technology available to detectives was limited compared with what investigators would have decades later. Still, detectives preserved what they could. Among the evidence was blood that did not belong to Teresa. That blood mattered. It was biological evidence left by someone connected to the attack. But an unknown blood sample is only useful if investigators can identify the person it came from. For years, the answer was no. The sample was eventually entered into CODIS, the national system used to compare DNA profiles from convicted offenders, forensic evidence, and other categories. Detectives hoped for a hit. Nothing came. Again and again, nothing came. The DNA belonged to someone, but no name appeared. The killer remained outside the system. And time kept moving. Teresa's son grew older. Her family aged. The detectives who originally worked the case moved on. Some retired. Some died. The file remained. A cold case. A photograph. A name. A family still waiting. In 2015, Detective Matthew Newbold inherited Teresa's case. By then, nearly 3 decades had passed since the murder. Most investigators would have understood immediately how difficult the case had become. The physical evidence was decades old. The suspect could be dead. Witness memories could have faded. People could have moved. Relationships could have changed. Entire neighborhoods could have changed. But Newbold kept Teresa's photograph on the wall of his office. He had never met her. He had not been there in 1986. But the photograph became a reminder. A reminder that behind the evidence number was a real person. A daughter. A mother. A sister. A nurse. Someone who had once walked into her home, believing she would leave again. She never did. Newbold continued working. Years went by. The case did not disappear from his desk. And then technology began changing what cold case investigators believed was possible. The DNA sample that had produced nothing in conventional databases could potentially be analyzed in another way. Instead of asking, "Whose DNA is this?" investigators could ask a different question. Who is related to the person whose DNA this is? That was the doorway into forensic genetic genealogy. In 2022, Polk County investigators partnered with Othram, a private laboratory specializing in forensic genetic genealogy for cold cases. The old biological evidence was analyzed again. The objective was not simply to find a direct database match. It was to build a family tree, to follow genetic relationships backward and sideways through generations. The search moved beyond the traditional criminal database. And suddenly, the unknown man at Teresa's crime scene was no longer completely unknown. There were relatives. Distant relatives. Names began appearing. Branches began forming. The investigation moved backward through family history. And one branch led investigators to an unusual event from 1949. A child had been born outside marriage. The circumstances surrounding that birth created a previously obscure genetic connection. The connection was not to Donald Douglas directly. It was through a distant relative. But DNA does not need a suspect's name to begin telling a story. It only needs relationships. A third cousin. Another generation. Another branch. Another connection. Investigators followed the family tree. Slowly. Methodically. Until the genetic map narrowed. The unknown blood donor was no longer somewhere in an enormous population. The circle was tightening. And eventually, investigators began focusing on Donald Douglas. The man who had lived directly behind Teresa. The man detectives had spoken to in 1986. The man who had not appeared suspicious enough to become a suspect. The man who had somehow remained outside the reach of the DNA databases. There was another problem. Donald Douglas was dead. He had died in 2008 of natural causes. He was 54 years old. His body had been cremated. There would be no opportunity to obtain a fresh sample directly from him. And because he had never been arrested, his DNA had never entered a law enforcement database. The man investigators now believe had murdered Teresa had been dead for 15 years before his name was connected to the case. There would be no interrogation. No courtroom confession. No dramatic arrest. No moment when detectives could place handcuffs on him and ask why. But there was something else. A son. Investigators obtained a DNA sample from Donald Douglas's son. The comparison produced the breakthrough they had been searching for. The genetic evidence indicated a biological parent-child relationship with the unknown blood profile. The blood found at Teresa's murder scene belonged to Donald Douglas, the man who had been interviewed in 1986, the neighbor who lived directly behind Teresa, the man whose name had never appeared as a criminal suspect in the original investigation, the man who had died years before science could identify him. The case that had survived for nearly 4 decades had finally reached an answer. And yet the answer created another question. Why? Why Teresa? Why that day? Why did Douglas enter her home? What happened between them? What did investigators fail to see in 1986? The sheriff's office said the attack was sexually motivated. Sheriff Grady Judd later described the case as involving what investigators believed was some form of sexual rejection. But the exact circumstances of the encounter remain part of the historical record that cannot be fully reconstructed. The killer is dead. Teresa is dead. The only people who knew exactly what happened inside that house are gone. That is the cruelest feature of a cold case solved after the suspect's death. You can identify the person. You can establish the biological connection. You can tell the family who did it. But you cannot ask him what he was thinking. You cannot ask him what happened during those final moments. You cannot make him stand in a courtroom and hear Teresa's name. You cannot hear an apology. You cannot hear an explanation. You can only look at the evidence. And the evidence had waited. For 37 years. The family had waited too. Every October brought the anniversary. Every anniversary reopened the wound. There was no answer to give Teresa's son. No name to place beside the question. No explanation for why his mother had been taken from him. For decades, the family lived with uncertainty. They knew how Teresa died, but they did not know who had done it. That distinction matters. A murder without a known killer creates an invisible space in a family's life. Every possibility remains alive. Every stranger could be questioned. Every rumor could be examined. Every new technology could create a moment of hope. Then another disappointment. But in 2023, that changed. The Polk County Sheriff's Office announced that the case had been solved. The photograph of Teresa was no longer simply the face of an unidentified killer's victim. Her family finally had a name. Donald Douglas. He had been 33 years old when Teresa was murdered. He had lived nearby. He had been questioned. And he had gone on living for more than 2 decades after the killing. He eventually died naturally in 2008. For years after his death, the case remained unsolved. Then DNA genealogy reached backward through his family tree and brought his name back into the investigation. That is what makes the Teresa Scalf case so extraordinary. The breakthrough did not come from a confession. It did not come from a new eyewitness. It did not come from a hidden weapon. It came from family. From a genetic connection that began decades before Teresa was born. A biological relationship created in 1949 ultimately helped investigators identify a man connected to a murder committed in 1986. A family secret became a forensic clue. A distant relationship became an investigative roadmap. And a drop of blood left at a violent crime scene became the thread that connected three different eras. 1949, 1950, 1951. 3 years separated by generations. One biological line connecting them. But the science was only part of the story. There was also persistence. For decades, detectives refused to let Teresa's case disappear. One investigator after another opened the file. One generation of technology replaced another. The evidence remained. The question remained. And Teresa's photograph remained. Detective Matthew Newbold reportedly kept her photograph on his office wall for years. He told her family he would not retire until he solved the case. He never had the opportunity to question the killer. But he eventually had the opportunity to identify him. That distinction is important, because cold cases are not always solved with dramatic discoveries. Sometimes they are solved by someone refusing to stop looking. Sometimes the evidence is already sitting inside an evidence locker. Sometimes the answer has been there for decades, waiting for technology to become capable of reading it. The blood had been there all along. The killer's identity had been encoded in it. But in 1986, detectives did not have the tools. In the 1990s, they still did not have the tools. Even after Cody's became available, the sample remained unmatched. The killer had no criminal record, no database profile, no obvious forensic trail leading to his name. He existed outside the system. Until genealogy changed the question. Instead of searching for the killer directly, investigators searched for his relatives. And once a relative appeared, the family tree became a map. That map eventually led to Donald Douglas, the same man who had once been only a neighbor, a man whose name had been recorded during the original investigation, a man who, at the time, appeared to have nothing connecting him to Teresa's death. The irony is almost impossible to ignore. The killer was not necessarily hidden on another continent. He was not a mysterious stranger who vanished into another country. He lived close to the victim. He was part of the neighborhood. He was interviewed by police. And yet the investigation could not connect him to the blood. Not then. Not for decades. Only science changed that. When investigators finally established the connection through his son, they had something they had never possessed before. A genetic bridge. The blood from the crime scene. The son. The family tree. Donald Douglas. The chain was complete. And with it came an ending that no one could have predicted in 1986. The case was closed without an arrest. Without a trial. Without a sentence. Without a final confrontation. The person identified as Teresa's killer was already in the grave. For Teresa's family, that meant something complicated. There was relief. There was shock. There was grief. And there was the realization that the man responsible had lived for decades after the murder. He had grown older. He had built a life. He had reached old age. And he had died naturally. Meanwhile, Teresa's family had carried the consequences every single day. At the news conference announcing the breakthrough, Teresa's mother, Betty, was 84 years old. She had waited almost her entire adult life to hear who killed her daughter. She said she believed she had lived long enough to see the case solved for a reason. That moment captured the strange cruelty of cold cases. Justice sometimes arrives late. So late that the person who committed the crime is no longer alive. So late that the victim's mother is elderly. So late that a child who once lost his mother has become an adult. So late that the investigation is no longer simply about catching a murderer. It becomes about memory, about truth, about finally replacing an unanswered question with a name. But there is one thing DNA cannot recover. It cannot restore Teresa's life. It cannot give her son the mother he lost. It cannot return the family dinners, birthdays, conversations, and ordinary mornings that disappeared on October 27, 1986. It cannot erase the image her mother discovered inside that home. Science can identify. It can connect. It can prove relationships. But it cannot turn back time. And that is why the Teresa Scalf case remains so haunting. Because the greatest mystery was finally answered. But the tragedy could never be undone. For 37 years, the killer's identity remained hidden. Not because the evidence was gone. Not because the case had been forgotten. But because the technology needed to interpret the evidence had not yet arrived. A single biological trace survived. The suspect did not. The witnesses aged. The detectives changed. The databases expanded. Genetic genealogy emerged. And eventually, the past opened. A family tree revealed what a conventional database could not. A son provided what a dead suspect could no longer provide. And the blood finally had a name. Donald Douglas. The man who lived behind Teresa. The man investigators spoke with in 1986. The man whose DNA was never in the system. The man who died in 2008. The man whose identity was finally established 15 years after his death. That is the final twist in Teresa Scalf's story. The case was solved by a future the killer could never have imagined. In 1986, DNA was evidence. In 2023, DNA became a family tree. And somewhere between those two eras, a cold case that had seemed almost impossible finally cracked open. For Teresa's family, the silence of 37 years ended with a name. But the questions surrounding her final moments will never be fully answered. The killer cannot speak. The victim cannot speak. The house is no longer the same. The neighborhood has changed. The people who first investigated the crime have grown old or passed away. But the evidence remained. And so did Teresa's photograph. A young woman in a nurse's uniform. A face frozen in time. 29 years old forever. A daughter. A mother. A sister. A nurse. And finally, a victim whose name no longer has to be followed by the words unsolved murder. For decades, her family had one sentence hanging over them. Who killed Teresa Scalf? The answer came 37 years later. Not from the killer. Not from a confession. Not from a courtroom. It came from the blood he left behind. It came through relatives he never expected investigators to find. It came through a family connection stretching back to 1949. And it came because one detective refused to take Teresa's photograph off his wall. The cold case was no longer cold. The mystery was no longer without a name. But the passage of time had left its own scar. Justice had finally found the truth. It had simply taken almost 4 decades to get there. And somewhere in the evidence room, the blood that once seemed silent had finally spoken. It said the name of the man who had been there. Donald Douglas. And after 37 years, Teresa Scalf's family finally knew. The name had finally been spoken. Donald Douglas. But for Teresa Scalf's family, hearing that name did not erase 37 years of silence. It made the silence louder. Because once a cold case is solved, people often imagine that everything suddenly falls into place. The mystery disappears. The questions disappear. The pain disappears. But that is not what happens. Sometimes the answer creates an entirely new landscape of questions. And Teresa's case was filled with them. How could the man responsible have lived so close to her? How could investigators have spoken to him in 1986 without realizing what they were looking at? How could a biological trace sit inside the case file for decades while the person who left it behind continued living his life? And perhaps the most disturbing question of all, how many times did Teresa's family pass the place where her killer had once lived? For decades, the family had no name. They had only memories. They remembered Teresa before the murder. They remembered the woman who worked as a nurse. They remembered her as a mother. They remembered her smile. They remembered her voice, her routines, her habits. The small details that become precious when someone is suddenly gone. But there was another memory that could never be separated from those memories. October 27th, 1986. That date became a permanent dividing line. Before Teresa. After Teresa. Everything that came before belonged to a life that could never return. Everything after became a search for an explanation. And the investigation itself became a story of changing technology. In 1986, detectives had to work with what they could see, touch, and document. They interviewed people. They searched homes. They collected fingerprints. They examined physical evidence. They spoke with neighbors. They tried to reconstruct movements from memory. Every hour mattered. Every inconsistency mattered. Every person who had been near Teresa became part of the investigative picture. But human memory has limits. A witness can remember a face incorrectly. A neighbor can forget a vehicle. A conversation can disappear from memory within days. And in a murder investigation, one forgotten detail can become the difference between an arrest and an unsolved case. Then there was DNA. At the time of Teresa's murder, forensic DNA analysis was still in its infancy. The technology that would eventually transform criminal investigations was not yet capable of doing what investigators would later ask it to do. So the evidence remained, preserved, waiting. Years passed. The world changed around it. Children became adults. Adults became grandparents. Technology moved from laboratories into ordinary homes. Computers became smaller. Databases became larger. Genetic testing became available to millions of people. People began sending their DNA to companies to discover their ancestry. They searched for relatives. They built family trees. They found biological connections they never knew existed. And investigators eventually realized that those same connections could be used to solve murders. The logic was revolutionary. A criminal does not necessarily need to be in a database. A relative might be. And if that relative is distant enough, investigators can sometimes build a family tree until the identity of the unknown person begins to emerge. That was the strategy eventually used in Teresa's case. The old evidence was not dead. It was waiting for a new question. Instead of asking only who the blood belonged to, investigators began asking who might be genetically connected to the person who left it. That distinction changed everything. The sample that had once produced silence became the starting point of a new investigation. The work was painstaking. Genetic genealogy is not a magic search engine. It does not simply produce a suspect's name. Investigators must examine relationships. They must separate maternal and paternal lines. They must account for generations. They must consider marriages, adoptions, undocumented births, and family secrets. They must eliminate people who appear genetically connected but could not possibly have committed the crime. And in a case that began in 1986, they must reconstruct a world that no longer exists. That is exactly what investigators did. The DNA pointed toward a family. The family pointed toward relatives. The relatives pointed toward another branch. And eventually, investigators encountered a connection that had been almost invisible for generations. A child born in 1949. A birth outside marriage. A family relationship that had never seemed relevant to a homicide investigation. But genetics does not care whether a family relationship was publicly acknowledged. DNA records biological history. And biological history leaves traces. One connection led to another. The investigators kept building. The tree became larger, then smaller. They eliminated branches. They tested possibilities. They compared information. Slowly, the unknown man became less unknown. And eventually, the investigation returned to a name already present in the original case. Donald Douglas. That moment must have been extraordinary for the investigators. Because this was not a completely new name pulled from nowhere. It was a name from the old file. A name attached to a man who had lived behind Teresa. A name connected to someone who had been part of the original neighborhood investigation. Decades earlier, detectives had already spoken to him. Now, decades later, science was bringing him back. The case had come full circle. But the suspect was dead. Douglas had died in 2008. Natural causes. 15 years before investigators publicly announced the breakthrough. He could not be arrested. He could not be questioned. He could not challenge the evidence. He could not explain his movements. He could not tell investigators what happened inside Teresa's home. That is the strange finality of a cold case, solved too late. The investigation can reach its destination. But the suspect is no longer there. There is no dramatic interrogation room. No detective sliding photographs across a table. No suspect lowering his head. No final confession. There is only evidence. And in Teresa's case, that evidence was biological. Investigators obtained DNA from Douglas's son. The comparison was devastating. The son shared a genetic relationship consistent with the unknown blood found at the crime scene. The biological trail led directly to Douglas. The man who had been standing in the background of the original investigation was suddenly at its center. The significance was enormous. For decades, Teresa's murder had been one of those cases that seemed destined to remain unresolved. A case that would eventually become a story told by older generations. A photograph in a newspaper archive. A file in a sheriff's office. A name on a list of Florida cold cases. But the evidence refused to die. And neither did the investigation. The revelation also demonstrated one of the most unsettling realities of modern forensic science. You may be able to escape a criminal database. You may never be arrested. You may never leave your own DNA in a police system. But you cannot necessarily escape your biological family. Every human being carries a genetic history. Parents, grandparents, siblings, cousins, distant relatives, thousands of biological connections. A person may remain unknown, but their family tree can become a map. That map eventually led investigators to Donald Douglas, and it transformed a question that had survived for nearly 4 decades. For Teresa's son, the news must have carried a complicated mixture of emotions. Imagine growing up without knowing who killed your mother. Imagine hearing the question repeatedly. Imagine anniversaries arriving year after year. Imagine seeing your mother's photograph and knowing that somewhere in the world, the person responsible was living. Or perhaps you wondered whether he was still alive. Whether he had moved away. Whether he had started another family. Whether he had ever felt fear that detectives might finally find him. Then imagine learning that the person was already dead. There is no confrontation. No chance to ask why. No chance to look him in the eyes. The answer comes without the person who carried it. That is not the ending most families imagine. But it is an ending. And for Teresa's mother, Betty, the breakthrough came when she was 84 years old. She had spent almost her entire life carrying the question, "Who killed my daughter?" Decades had passed. Teresa's son had grown up. The little boy who once needed his mother had become an adult. The world around the family had changed, but the murder remained. Until suddenly it did not. The investigators had a name, and the name belonged to someone who had been close to the crime scene from the beginning. The case demonstrated another uncomfortable truth. Sometimes the answer is not far away. Sometimes it is standing in the background. Sometimes the person investigators need to identify has already been interviewed. But without the technology to connect physical evidence to identity, suspicion remains suspicion. There must be proof. That was what DNA provided. Not a theory. Not a rumor. Not an accusation. A biological connection. And that connection allowed investigators to close a case that had remained open for 37 years. But closing a case does not mean every mystery has been solved. There are still unknown details surrounding Teresa's final moments. There are still questions about what exactly happened inside her home. There are still details that only the killer could have explained. Those answers disappeared with Donald Douglas. And perhaps that is the final cruelty. The truth arrived. But it arrived incomplete. It arrived in the form of science rather than confession. It arrived through relatives rather than the suspect himself. It arrived after the man responsible was already dead. Still, for Teresa's family, one unbearable uncertainty had finally been removed. They no longer had to wonder whether the killer was still alive. They no longer had to wonder whether he might someday strike again. They no longer had to imagine an unknown stranger walking freely somewhere in Florida. They had a name. And sometimes, in a cold case, a name is the first form of peace. Not forgiveness. Not closure in the perfect sense, but certainty. Teresa had not disappeared into history. Her case had not been forgotten. The evidence had survived. The detectives had kept searching. And decades later, the technology finally caught up with the crime. A nurse went to work. A mother disappeared from the life of her young son. A community was shaken. A killer walked away. And a tiny biological trace remained behind. For 37 years, it said nothing. Then science learned how to listen. And when it finally spoke, it did not give investigators a theory. It gave them a family. It gave them a relationship. It gave them a name. Donald Douglas. The case that once seemed impossible had finally been answered. But Teresa's story was never really about the man who killed her. It was about the woman whose life was stolen. The mother whose son had to grow up without her. The daughter whose family waited decades for an answer. The nurse whose future ended inside her own home. And the photograph that remained on a detective's wall, silently demanding that someone keep looking. 37 years is an almost unimaginable amount of time. But evidence does not understand time. Blood does not know that decades have passed. DNA does not forget. And sometimes, the smallest trace left behind at the worst moment of a person's life can survive long enough to speak for them. Teresa could not tell investigators what happened, but the evidence could. And after nearly 4 decades of silence, it finally did. For 37 years, the evidence waited. Not in a courtroom. Not in a confession. Not in the memory of a witness. It waited in silence. A biological trace collected after a brutal murder in Lakeland, Florida, in 1986. At the time, investigators could not make it speak. They knew it belonged to a man. They knew that man had been inside Teresa Scalf's home. They knew his blood was connected to the violence. But they did not know his name. That distinction became the entire case. A name was what Teresa's family needed. A name was what detectives could not provide. and every year that passed seemed to push that name farther away. 1987, 1988, 1989. The calendar kept moving. Teresa did not. Her photograph remained frozen at 29. Her son grew older. Her mother grew older. The detectives who had worked the original investigation eventually moved on. Some left law enforcement. Some retired. Some never lived long enough to see the case solved. But the evidence stayed. The blood stayed. And, eventually, the technology changed. That is where the story takes an extraordinary turn. Because the breakthrough did not begin with a new witness walking into a police station. It did not begin with someone confessing on their deathbed. It did not begin with a secret diary. It began with genetics. Forensic genetic genealogy had changed the way investigators approached unidentified DNA. Instead of searching only for an exact match inside a law enforcement database, investigators could search for relatives. That meant the killer did not necessarily need to be in the system. A cousin could be. A distant relative could be. Someone who had never heard of Teresa Scalf could unknowingly carry part of the genetic clue investigators needed. That was the extraordinary possibility. The killer could be dead. The killer could be absent from every police database. But his family tree could still exist. And investigators began following it. The work was complicated. The original DNA profile had to be suitable for deeper analysis. Specialized laboratory techniques were required. The genetic data had to be interpreted. Potential relatives had to be identified. Family relationships had to be reconstructed. And every branch had to be examined against the historical facts of the crime. This was not a simple computer search. It was detective work at the molecular level. The investigators were essentially asking a question that could not have been asked in 1986. Who is biologically connected to the unknown man who left this blood? That question opened a door. Behind it was a family. The family extended through generations. Some relatives were obvious. Others were not. Some relationships were publicly known. Others were buried in old records. And one particularly significant connection involved a child born in 1949 under circumstances that had remained largely hidden from the public. A birth outside marriage. A family connection that had not seemed important for decades. But genetically it mattered. The investigators followed the line. Generation by generation. Name by name. Relationship by relationship. And the enormous family tree slowly became narrower. Until there was Donald Douglas. The discovery must have carried an almost surreal quality. Because Douglas was not a stranger. He had been part of the original neighborhood investigation. He had lived directly behind Teresa. He was close enough geographically to matter. Yet in 1986, investigators had no DNA technology capable of making the crucial connection. There was no genetic genealogy. There was no family tree analysis. There was no way to compare the crime scene blood against a son decades later. The investigation had been limited by the technology of its era. Now, technology was removing that limitation. But there was still a problem. Douglas was dead. He had died in 2008. Natural causes. 15 years before the sheriff's office announced the identification. The man investigators believed had murdered Teresa could never be arrested. That detail changes the emotional weight of the entire case. A solved murder normally ends with a suspect being taken into custody. Teresa's case did not. There would be no handcuffs, no booking photograph, no bail hearing, no courtroom, no sentence, no prison cell. Instead, there was a grave. The suspect had already died. But investigators still needed to establish the connection scientifically. They obtained a DNA sample from Douglas's son. The comparison became the critical link. The unknown blood from Teresa's crime scene was genetically connected to Douglas through his son. The investigation had moved from possibility to identification. The man who had been unknown for decades now had a name: Donald Douglas. And that name had been sitting inside the original story all along. This is where the case becomes almost painfully ironic. The killer had not necessarily disappeared into some distant world. He had lived close to Teresa. He had been part of the community. He had been questioned. Then he continued living. For more than 20 years after Teresa's death, he remained outside the reach of investigators. Every anniversary passed. Every Christmas. Every birthday. Every family gathering. The Scalf family continued living with the absence. Douglas continued living with whatever secret he carried. Until his death in 2008. At that point, the traditional investigation had lost the opportunity for an interrogation forever. But the evidence had not lost its value. That is the power of forensic evidence. It does not care whether the suspect is alive. It does not care whether the suspect has moved away. It does not care whether the detective who collected it has retired. If properly preserved, biological evidence can remain useful for decades. The blood found in 1986 had survived. And eventually, science became capable of extracting more information from it. That is why cold cases are so different from ordinary investigations. A case can be quiet without being dead. A file can sit untouched without being forgotten. A piece of evidence can remain dormant until technology changes its meaning. Teresa's murder was one of those cases. The original investigators had not failed because they did not care. They were working within the limits of what was possible. Today, investigators have tools that would have sounded like science fiction in 1986. They can examine DNA at an extraordinary level. They can identify relatives. They can reconstruct family trees. They can revisit evidence collected before modern genetic techniques existed. And sometimes, those tools can turn an impossible case into a solvable one. Teresa's case became an example of exactly that. But behind the science was a human tragedy. Her son was only 8 years old when his mother was killed. A child should remember his mother through ordinary things. Her voice. Her cooking. Her hugs. The way she called his name. The routines of childhood. Instead, the memory of Teresa became intertwined with the crime. A mother was gone. And the reason remained unknown. For a child, that kind of uncertainty can shape an entire life. Who did it? Why? Was the person caught? Was he still alive? Could he hurt someone else? Those questions have no expiration date. They follow families through generations. That is why the announcement of a cold case breakthrough can be emotionally complicated. The family may feel relief. But relief does not mean happiness. There is no happiness in discovering who murdered your mother. There is only the end of uncertainty. The knowledge that the question has an answer. For Teresa's mother, Betty, the answer arrived when she was 84. She had lived decades without it. She had watched her grandson grow up. She had carried Teresa's memory. She had watched investigators come and go. And eventually, investigators told her that the man responsible had been identified. The man was already dead. But the name was real. Donald Douglas. That name transformed the story. Before the identification, the family had been living with an unknown killer. Afterward, they were living with a known killer who could no longer be confronted. Those are very different forms of pain. One is uncertainty. The other is finality. And finality can be brutal. Because once the suspect is dead, there is no possibility of asking the questions that remained unanswered. Why Teresa? Why her home? What happened immediately before the attack? What did he say? What did she say? Was there an argument? Was there an attempt to escape? Did anyone hear anything? Did Douglas ever tell another person? Did he ever confess privately? Did he ever regret what he had done? Those questions may never be answered. The science can identify a person. It cannot reconstruct every human thought. It cannot recreate the final conversation. It cannot tell a family why their loved one was targeted. And perhaps that is what makes the case so haunting. The investigation succeeded. But the story still contains darkness. There is no perfect ending, only an established truth. The man responsible was Donald Douglas. His DNA was connected to the blood found at Teresa's crime scene. His son provided the crucial comparison. Genetic genealogy connected the unknown biological evidence to the Douglas family. And the investigation ultimately closed. That sequence is extraordinary when viewed against the timeline. In 1986, the blood was evidence. In the following decades, it became an unanswered question. In 2022, investigators revisited it using advanced genetic genealogy. In 2023, the public learned that the case had been solved. A murder that had survived almost 4 decades had finally been given an identity. This is why Teresa Scalf's story belongs to a larger transformation in criminal investigations. For generations, unsolved murders were often limited by the witnesses investigators could find and the records they could access. If the killer left no fingerprint match, no confession, and no known criminal history, the case could become frozen. DNA changed that. Then genetic genealogy changed DNA. It created the possibility of solving cases where traditional DNA databases had failed. The key was no longer finding the suspect directly. It was finding the suspect's relatives. The concept is simple. The execution is anything but. Investigators must understand genetics. They must understand genealogy. They must understand family structures. They must understand historical records. They must carefully eliminate false possibilities. And they must still build a criminal case that can withstand scrutiny. In Teresa's case, the science led investigators toward Douglas. Then the comparison with his son provided a powerful confirmation. The result was not merely a theory. It was a forensic breakthrough. But there is another reason the case remains important. It demonstrates why families of homicide victims continue asking law enforcement to preserve evidence. Because the technology of today may not be the technology of tomorrow. A sample that cannot solve a murder now might solve it 10 years later. A fingerprint that once produced nothing might become useful when databases expand. A photograph might become clearer through new imaging techniques. A family relationship that appears irrelevant might become the key. Time can destroy evidence. But sometimes time also creates the opportunity to understand it. That is exactly what happened here. The blood survived. The family tree survived. The record survived. And Teresa's name survived. 37 years after her death, the case was no longer a mystery without an identity. The killer had been identified. But Teresa herself remained the center of the story. Because if there is one danger in true crime reporting, it is allowing the murderer to become more famous than the victim. Teresa was not simply the nurse who was murdered. She was a person. She had a profession. She had a child. She had a mother who loved her. She had a life that existed before the crime. The murder took that life away. The investigation spent 37 years trying to identify the person responsible. But the reason the investigation mattered was Teresa. Every test, every interview, every database search, every genetic comparison, every branch of the family tree, it all led back to one woman whose life ended far too soon. And perhaps that is the most powerful legacy of the case. Not the name of the killer, but the fact that Teresa was never completely forgotten. Her case survived. Her evidence survived. Her family kept asking. And eventually, the answer came. Not when it was convenient. Not when anyone expected it. But when science finally became capable of hearing what the evidence had been saying all along. 37 years later, the blood had a name. And the name was Donald Douglas. The name Donald Douglas had changed everything. But it also forced investigators to look backward. Back to the neighborhood. Back to October 27, 1986. Back to the people who had been there when Teresa Scalf was still alive. And back to one uncomfortable fact that had remained hidden in plain sight for decades. Donald Douglas lived directly behind Teresa. He was not a stranger who appeared from nowhere. He was part of the physical landscape surrounding her home. A neighbor. A familiar face. Someone who could move through the area without immediately attracting attention. In a cold case, proximity does not prove guilt. It never has. But after the DNA identification, that proximity became impossible to ignore. Investigators could now look at the original case through a completely different lens. In 1986, detectives had been trying to solve a murder with limited forensic technology. In 2023, they had something the original investigators could never have possessed. A genetic connection. Suddenly, old interviews mattered again. Old notes mattered. Old timelines mattered. Names written down decades earlier mattered. Every detail had the potential to acquire a new meaning. That is one of the strangest experiences in cold case investigations. A fact can remain unchanged for 30 years. Only the interpretation changes. The neighborhood may have looked different. The people may have moved. The streets may have been rebuilt. But the question remained the same. What happened to Teresa? She had been a 29-year-old nurse. She had a young son. She had a career. She had a home. Then, in a matter of hours, her life became a homicide investigation. The violence inside that home was immediate. The consequences were permanent. Investigators determined that Teresa had suffered severe injuries to her neck. Her hands showed signs of defensive wounds. Those injuries told a silent story. She had fought back. She had resisted. She had understood that she was in danger. And somewhere during that struggle, the attacker was injured. Blood was left behind. That blood became the most important witness in the case. It could not speak, but it could identify the person who had left it. The problem was that the science of 1986 could not make the connection. For investigators working at the time, the blood was one piece of a much larger puzzle. They had to reconstruct the scene using conventional methods. They needed to know who had been near the house, who had seen Teresa, who had a possible motive, who could enter without being noticed, who could have been injured during the attack, who had behaved strangely afterward. Those questions generated leads. But leads are not answers. And eventually, the case stalled. The file became a cold case. The word itself carries a certain weight. Cold. As if the investigation has lost its heat. But Teresa's family never experienced it that way. For them, nothing was cold. The grief was not cold. The memories were not cold. The anniversary was not cold. Every year, the date returned. Every year, Teresa remained 29. And every year, the family had to live with the same unanswered question. Who did this? The passage of time can create the illusion that a case becomes less important. The opposite can be true. For a family, time can make unanswered questions more painful. A child grows up. A mother becomes elderly. Family photographs accumulate. new generations are born, and the person who was murdered becomes increasingly distant from the world around them. But not from the people who loved them. That was Teresa's reality. Her son grew older without his mother. Her mother grew older without her daughter. And investigators continued to live with a case that had never been solved. Then, years later, Detective Matthew Newbold took responsibility for the investigation. By that point, the case was almost 3 decades old. The original crime scene was long gone. The immediate memories were fading. But the evidence remained. Newbold reportedly kept Teresa's photograph in his office. That photograph represented something larger than a file number. It was a reminder that the victim was not simply evidence. She had been a person. Someone who had expected to wake up the next morning. Someone who had expected to watch her son grow. Someone who had expected more birthdays. More shifts at the hospital. More ordinary days. None of those days came. For Newbold, the question became personal in a professional sense. Could the case still be solved? At first, the answer was uncertain. The conventional investigative path had produced nothing decisive. The DNA had produced no direct database hit. Donald Douglas was not sitting in a criminal database waiting to be identified. He had never been convicted of a crime that would have placed his DNA into the system. And by the time investigators began looking at the case through modern genetic genealogy, he had already been dead for years. That meant investigators needed a different strategy. They needed to go around the missing suspect. Instead of Douglas, they needed his family. That was where genetic genealogy became crucial. The old crime scene DNA was transformed into a detailed genetic profile. Then investigators searched for relatives. The first connections did not immediately point to Teresa's killer. They pointed to branches of a family. That is how genealogy works. The first relative is rarely the answer. The relative is a doorway. Investigators follow the relationship. Then another. Then another. They build a tree. They compare ages, locations, family structures, birth records, historical information. The process can feel painfully slow, but the objective is precision. One wrong branch can send investigators in the wrong direction. One forgotten adoption can change an entire family tree. One undocumented birth can alter the relationship between multiple people. And one distant cousin can suddenly become the key to a murder. In Teresa's case, the family tree eventually exposed a genetic connection involving a child born in 1949. That detail might sound insignificant. It was anything but. The birth created a connection between family branches that investigators could use to narrow the identity of the unknown man. The tree began shrinking. Possible candidates were removed. Others became more significant. The investigation moved toward Douglas. And the closer investigators came to his name, the more striking the original circumstances became. He had been right there, behind Teresa's home, part of the neighborhood, part of the original investigation. And yet the case had gone unsolved. The modern DNA work did not simply discover a random suspect. It brought investigators back to a person who had already existed in the historical record of the crime. That is what made the breakthrough so powerful. It was not only about modern science. It was about modern science finally connecting with old-fashioned police work. The original detectives had documented names. The new investigators had DNA. The two eras finally met. And when they did, the unknown blood donor became Donald Douglas. But investigators still needed confirmation. Because a genealogical connection alone is not the end of a homicide investigation. It is a lead. A powerful lead. But a lead nonetheless. The next step was critical. Investigators obtained a DNA sample from Douglas's son. The comparison provided the relationship investigators needed. The unknown DNA from the crime scene was consistent with Douglas being the biological father of the tested individual. The evidence now had a direct route to the dead suspect. There was no need to recover DNA from Douglas himself. His son had provided the genetic bridge, and that bridge crossed 37 years. Suddenly, the case had a beginning and an end. The blood came from the killer. The killer was Donald Douglas, the neighbor, the man who had lived directly behind Teresa, the man who had been questioned in the aftermath of the murder, the man who later died naturally in 2008. The investigation had finally answered its central question. But the answer did not bring Teresa back, and it did not explain everything. That is where the case becomes emotionally difficult. A murder investigation seeks facts. Families seek meaning. Those are not always the same thing. Police can establish who committed a crime. They may never establish why that person chose that victim. They may never know what the victim's final words were. They may never know exactly what the killer was thinking. And when the suspect is dead, some questions become permanently unreachable. There would be no trial, no cross-examination, no opportunity for prosecutors to present every detail before a jury, no opportunity for the defense to challenge the evidence. No sentence. The legal system could not provide the traditional ending. Instead, the case was closed through forensic identification. The sheriff's office could say who investigators believed was responsible. The family could finally hear the name, and history could finally record an answer. But the emotional ending was far more complicated. Imagine waiting nearly 40 years for the name of the person who murdered your daughter. Then imagine learning that the man has been dead for 15 years. There is relief. But there is also anger. There may be disbelief. There may be a sense of stolen time. The family did not get the chance to see justice happen in real time. They did not get to watch the killer stand before a judge. They did not get to hear him explain himself. They did not get to see a sentence imposed. They simply learned that the person responsible had already lived out his life. That reality can be difficult to process. For Teresa's mother, the breakthrough came at an age when many people are thinking about grandchildren, retirement, and family memories. Instead, she was finally receiving an answer to a question that had dominated her life for decades. Her daughter had been murdered. Now she knew by whom. And that knowledge came from a technology that did not exist when Teresa was alive. That is the paradox of the case. The same future that Teresa never got to see eventually solved the mystery of her death. The computers, the databases, the genetic testing, the genealogy, the forensic laboratories, all of these tools emerged long after Teresa was gone. But they reached backward. They reached into 1986. They reached into an evidence locker. They reached into a family tree. And they pulled out a name. This is why investigators continue to revisit old homicide evidence. Because evidence has a lifespan that can be longer than a detective's career. A detective can retire. A sheriff can leave office. A laboratory can change. A database can expand, but a preserved DNA sample can remain, waiting. A cold case may appear frozen, but science is never truly frozen. Technology keeps moving, and every technological advance creates a possibility that did not exist before. Teresa's case demonstrated that principle in the most personal way possible. The blood had been there. The family connection had been there. The suspect had been there. What was missing was the ability to connect all three. 37 years later, that connection finally existed. The case no longer depended on memory alone. It no longer depended on a witness remembering a face from 1986. It no longer depended on someone voluntarily confessing. The evidence could speak for itself. And the evidence pointed to a man who had lived behind Teresa, a man who had been close enough to be questioned, a man whose identity had remained hidden from investigators for decades, a man who died believing, perhaps, that the secret would die with him. But it did not. The secret survived him. It survived his death. It survived the passage of time. It survived the disappearance of the original crime scene. It survived the fading memories of witnesses. It survived the retirement of investigators. And finally, it survived the killer himself. Because DNA does not require a confession. It does not require a living suspect. It does not require a witness to remember. It requires only a biological connection. And that connection remained. 37 years later, it was enough. The mystery had a name. The name had a history. And the history led back to a quiet Florida neighborhood where a young nurse's life had ended. The case was no longer a question, but the silence surrounding Teresa's final moments would remain. And that silence is perhaps the final piece of the story. Because science can tell us who. It can tell us how a biological connection was established. It can tell us when the evidence was collected. It can tell us how investigators moved through a family tree. But science cannot tell us everything a victim felt in the final minutes of her life. Only Teresa knew that. And she never had the chance to tell anyone. 37 years passed before the world finally learned the name of the man responsible. But for Teresa, there was no 37-year wait. There was only one final day. One final struggle. One final moment. And then silence. The investigation spent decades trying to break that silence. In the end, it was not a confession that broke it. It was blood. It was DNA. It was family. And it was the persistence of investigators who refused to allow Teresa Scalf's name to become another forgotten line in the history of unsolved murders. The case had waited. The family had waited. The evidence had waited. And finally, after almost 4 decades, the answer came. Too late to save Teresa, but not too late to tell the truth. The truth had finally arrived. But truth, when it comes nearly 4 decades late, does not arrive quietly. It tears open old memories. It forces families to look backward. It makes investigators revisit decisions made when the world was very different. And in Teresa Scalf's case, the truth forced everyone to reconsider a question that had haunted Polk County for generations. How had a murder committed in broad daylight remained unsolved for so long? The answer was not one mistake. It was not one missed fingerprint. It was not one detective failing to ask the right question. It was a combination of time, technology, circumstance, and the simple limitations of an investigation conducted in 1986. At that time, detectives had no way to search a nationwide genetic family tree. They could not upload an unidentified crime scene profile and receive a list of distant biological relatives. They could not use a suspect's adult child to establish a genetic connection decades after the crime. Those tools simply did not exist. So investigators relied on what they had. Witness statements, physical evidence, interviews, records, human memory, and instinct. They built the best case they could, but the killer remained outside their reach. And the years began to erase the edges of the investigation. People moved away. Neighbors changed. The original investigators aged. The community changed. Even the physical environment around Teresa's home changed. But one thing remained remarkably stable: the biological evidence. A sample collected after the murder could still contain information. That is the strange power of DNA. It is microscopic. It is invisible. It can fit on a swab. And yet it can carry information across generations. In Teresa's case, that tiny trace eventually crossed nearly 40 years. It crossed from 1986 into the modern era. It crossed from a crime scene into a laboratory, from a laboratory into a genetic database, from a database into a family tree, and from a family tree back into the original investigation. The path was anything but straight. It was built one relationship at a time. That is what makes forensic genetic genealogy so powerful. It does not necessarily identify a murderer directly. It can identify a family. Then investigators use traditional detective work to narrow the possibilities. In Teresa's case, the genetic trail ultimately pointed toward Donald Douglas, the man who had once lived directly behind Teresa. That detail remains one of the most unsettling aspects of the case, because proximity creates a strange kind of irony. The answer had been geographically close, but scientifically unreachable. A neighbor can be familiar without being known. People live beside one another for years without understanding each other's private lives. They wave across fences. They recognize cars. They see each other in passing. But familiarity is not intimacy. And sometimes, the person living only a few steps away can remain a mystery. Teresa's killer did not need to cross an ocean. He did not need to disappear into another state. He only needed to remain outside the reach of the evidence. For years, he did. Then DNA changed the equation. When investigators began working with Othram and applying forensic genetic genealogy to the old evidence, they were no longer confined to the suspects known in 1986. The investigation could move into a much larger universe. The universe of biological relatives. That universe is enormous, but it is also structured. Every person is connected through DNA to other people. Parents, children, siblings, cousins, distant cousins. The further investigators go, the more complicated the tree becomes. But with enough data, the tree can also become surprisingly precise. Investigators eventually identified relatives associated with the unknown DNA. The genealogy pointed toward a particular family line, and the family line eventually pointed toward Douglas. Then came the crucial confirmation. His son. A living relative. A genetic connection that could be tested. The result provided the bridge between the unidentified crime scene DNA and the dead suspect. The case had moved from possibility to evidence. That moment would have been impossible in 1986. And it would have been impossible even decades later without the expansion of genetic databases and modern forensic laboratories. That is why the case is more than a story about one murder. It is also a story about how criminal investigations evolve. The methods that solve crimes today would have been unimaginable to detectives working 40 years ago. A cold case does not necessarily become weaker with time. Sometimes it becomes stronger, because the evidence remains while technology improves. A murder committed in 1986 can be investigated with tools developed in 2023. The suspect may be dead. The victim may have been gone for decades. But the evidence exists in both worlds. That creates an unusual relationship between past and present. Today's investigator can ask questions yesterday's investigator could not. And that is exactly what happened with Teresa's case. The modern investigation was able to revisit the old evidence without changing the original facts. Teresa was still 29. Her son was still 8 at the time of the murder. The crime still happened on October 27, 1986. The blood was still from the attacker. The neighborhood was still the same historical location. The only thing that changed was what investigators could do with the evidence. That difference was enough. The identification of Douglas also changed the meaning of the original neighborhood investigation. In 1986, investigators had spoken to people who lived near Teresa. Douglas was among them. At the time, There was no biological evidence tying him to the crime. There was no criminal record that automatically identified him as a dangerous offender. There was no forensic database match. So the investigation continued without him becoming the central suspect. That does not mean investigators had the answer and simply ignored it. It means the answer could not yet be scientifically established. That distinction is important. Cold cases are often discussed as though someone must have overlooked an obvious clue. Sometimes they did. But sometimes the clue was simply ahead of its time. Teresa's blood was one of those clues. It contained information investigators could not fully access. Decades later, science unlocked it. The result was devastating. The person connected to the biological evidence was not some unknown criminal from far away. It was someone already connected to the neighborhood. Someone who had been there. Someone who had been questioned. Someone whose name had existed in the case file for decades. That revelation must have changed the emotional landscape for investigators. It was no longer an anonymous offender. It was a person, a photograph, a history, a family, a life that continued long after Teresa's life had ended. And then there was another unsettling fact. Douglas had died naturally in 2008. That meant the truth had arrived after the possibility of punishment had disappeared. The legal system could identify him, but it could not prosecute him. The suspect could not stand trial. There was no jury. No verdict. No sentence. Only an official determination that the case had been solved. That kind of resolution can feel incomplete. Yet for families, certainty can still matter enormously. For decades, Teresa's loved ones had been forced to live with the possibility that the killer might still be somewhere out there. Perhaps watching the news. Perhaps living nearby. Perhaps having children and grandchildren. Perhaps dying peacefully without ever being identified. The discovery eliminated that uncertainty. The killer was dead. The threat was gone. The secret was exposed. And the family finally knew. That is not the same as justice in a courtroom. But it is truth. And truth can matter. Especially after decades of uncertainty. For Teresa's mother, Betty, the answer came when she was 84. She had spent more than half a century of her life knowing Teresa as her daughter and almost 4 decades knowing her as a murder victim. Those two identities are not the same. Before the murder, Teresa was simply Teresa. Afterward, she became a case. A victim. A photograph. A name in an investigation. But for her mother, she remained her daughter. That distinction is easy to lose in true crime stories. The headlines focus on the killer, the forensic breakthrough, the shocking twist, the number of years. But behind every cold case is a person who had plans. Teresa had plans. Her son had plans that included his mother. Her family had plans that included her. All of them disappeared in one day. That is what makes the case more than a forensic puzzle. It is a human tragedy. And when investigators finally solved it, they were not simply closing a file. They were returning a piece of the truth to a family. The answer could not change the past, but it could change the future. No more wondering. No more unknown suspect. No more waiting for a phone call that might never come. The family could finally say his name. Donald Douglas. A name that had once meant nothing in the context of Teresa's death. A name that became central decades later. That transformation is one of the defining characteristics of cold case investigations. Names can change meaning. A neighbor can become a suspect. A blood sample can become an identity. An old family record can become a forensic clue. A deceased person can become the center of a homicide investigation years after death. and an 8-year-old child can become an adult before learning who killed his mother. Time changes everything except the fact that the murder happened. The crime remains fixed. The investigation moves around it. That is why investigators return to old evidence. They know the past cannot change, but their ability to understand it can. Technology is constantly creating new ways to examine old crimes. DNA sequencing improves. Databases grow. Genealogy becomes more detailed. Digital records expand. Historical documents become searchable. Every year, another cold case becomes potentially solvable. Teresa's case became one of those cases, and the method used to identify Douglas carried a larger message. The absence of a direct DNA match does not necessarily mean the evidence is useless. A profile may fail to match a suspect today and still identify that suspect tomorrow through a relative. The person investigators need may never have been arrested. They may never have been in Cody's. They may even be dead. But their genetic relatives may still exist. That means the biological trail can outlive the criminal. And that is precisely what happened here. Douglas died in 2008. But the DNA he left behind in 1986 remained. His biological relationship with his son remained. His family's genetic history remained. The evidence waited until investigators could connect those pieces. That is the real reason the case survived. Not because someone was lucky. Not because a mysterious clue suddenly appeared. Because the evidence had not disappeared. The investigation had simply entered a different era. A murder that once seemed impossible to solve became solvable because science changed the rules. And once the rules changed, the old evidence became new again. That is why Teresa Scalf's name continued to matter. Her case was never truly dead. It was dormant, waiting. And when investigators finally returned to it with modern tools, the silence began to break. First came the genetic profile, then the relatives, then the family tree, then the name, then the comparison with Douglas's son, and finally, the conclusion. Donald Douglas was responsible. The killer had been identified. But the final mystery remained. Why did he do it? That question may never have an answer. The man who could provide it is gone. His story ended in 2008. Teresa's ended in 1986. The investigator's story continued until 2023. 3 different timelines. 3 different endings. One murder connecting them all. Perhaps that is why the Teresa Scalf case continues to resonate. It shows the extraordinary reach of forensic science. But it also shows its limits. DNA can tell us who. It cannot always tell us why. It can reveal family connections. It cannot recover lost conversations. It can identify a killer. It cannot restore a mother to her child. The science can close the case. It cannot close the wound. And that wound had existed for 37 years. The family carried it. The detectives carried it. The community carried it. Until finally, a name emerged from the genetic record. Donald Douglas. And once that name was known, the long silence surrounding Teresa's murder finally had an ending. Not the ending anyone would have imagined in 1986. Not an arrest. Not a trial. Not a prison sentence. Just the truth. A truth carried in blood. A truth hidden inside a family tree. A truth that survived the killer. A truth that survived nearly 4 decades. And a truth that finally returned Teresa's case to where it had always belonged. In the hands of the people who never stopped asking what happened to her. Because a cold case is not only a mystery, it is a promise. A promise that somewhere, somehow, the evidence may still be waiting. And sometimes, after decades of silence, it speaks. Teresa's evidence spoke. Her name was remembered. And the mystery that had haunted Florida for nearly 4 decades finally had an answer. The case had an answer. But an answer is not the same thing as an ending. For Teresa Scouf's family, the announcement in 2023 did not erase the morning after her murder. It did not erase the phone calls. It did not erase the police arriving at her home. It did not erase the sight of a young mother who would never return to her son. It did not erase the decades of uncertainty. What it did was change one word: unknown. For 37 years, the person responsible for Teresa's death had been unknown. Then suddenly he had a name: Donald Douglas. That name gave investigators something they had never possessed before: a direction, a history, a biological connection, and a reason to reopen every unanswered question surrounding the original investigation. The most disturbing part was how ordinary the story had looked from the outside. A neighborhood, a nurse, a young mother, a man living nearby, a routine police interview. Nothing immediately suggested that the killer was hiding inside the circle of familiar faces. That is often how the most difficult cold cases begin. There is no cinematic warning, no dramatic music, no strangers standing in the shadows. Life simply continues. People leave for work. Children go to school. Neighbors move through their daily routines. And somewhere inside that ordinary world, something terrible happens. On October 27, 1986, Teresa's ordinary world ended. Her death shocked the community. But shock eventually gives way to routine. The newspapers stop printing the story. The detectives move on to other cases. The public finds something else to talk about. The years become decades. The case becomes part of the background. But families do not move on in the same way. They adapt. They continue living. They celebrate birthdays. They attend weddings. They watch children grow. But the missing person remains missing from every important moment. Teresa was absent from her son's childhood. She was absent from his teenage years. She was absent from his adulthood. She was absent from the moments when he might have called his mother for advice. Every milestone carried the same invisible question. What would Teresa have thought? What would she have said? What would she have been like as a grandmother? Those are questions no forensic laboratory can answer. And yet the investigation continued searching for another question. Who killed her? For years, there was no answer. Then DNA genealogy changed the possibilities. Investigators were no longer limited to the people whose names appeared in the original police files. They could search through biological relationships. They could follow genetic clues through generations. And they could use modern laboratory science to extract information from evidence collected decades earlier. This was the point where Teresa's case became something larger than a traditional homicide investigation. It became a race between time and technology. Time had taken away witnesses. Time had taken away the suspect. Time had taken away the possibility of a confession. But technology had gained something. It had gained the ability to read the evidence more deeply. The DNA recovered from the crime scene became the starting point. Investigators worked with Othram, a laboratory known for forensic genetic genealogy. The objective was precise. Identify the family connected to the unknown male DNA. The process required patience. A genetic match does not simply say, "This is your murderer." Instead, it says something more subtle. This person is related to you. That relationship becomes the first thread. Investigators pull it. The thread leads to another, then another. And, eventually, a family tree begins to emerge. A cold case can therefore become a genealogy investigation. Births become clues. Marriages become clues. Siblings become clues. Distant cousins become clues. Even family events that happened decades before the murder can become relevant. In Teresa's case, investigators discovered a significant genetic connection involving a child born in 1949. That connection helped establish the family line. The further investigators went, the narrower the possibilities became. And eventually, one name remained especially important: Donald Douglas. He was not merely a genetic possibility. He had lived directly behind Teresa. He had been in the neighborhood. He had been interviewed during the original investigation. Now, decades later, his name had returned through DNA. The case had come full circle. But investigators could not simply announce a name and walk away. They needed confirmation. Douglas was dead. So investigators turned to his son. A DNA sample was obtained. The genetic relationship provided the critical link. The unknown blood from the crime scene could be connected to Donald Douglas through his biological child. The evidence had survived. The suspect had not. That created an unusual situation. Investigators had solved the homicide without being able to arrest the murderer. The suspect could not be questioned. He could not be prosecuted. He could not be confronted with the evidence. His death had closed that door forever. But another door had opened. The door to truth. That distinction mattered enormously to Teresa's family. For years, they had lived with the possibility that the person responsible might still be alive. The thought alone could be unbearable. What if he lived nearby? What if he had another family? What if he had children? What if he had told nobody? What if he had watched the case remain unsolved and felt safe? Those questions disappeared when investigators identified Douglas and confirmed that he had died in 2008. The killer was not still out there. He had been dead for years. But the truth had survived. And that truth came from something he could not take with him: his DNA. There is a strange irony in that. A person can hide their name. They can deny an accusation. They can move. They can change their appearance. They can leave town. But they cannot change their genetic identity. And when investigators can connect that identity to relatives, the passage of time becomes less powerful. The killer may disappear. The evidence can remain. That is why the Teresa Scalf case is so significant. It demonstrates that cold cases can survive their investigators. They can survive their suspects. They can survive their witnesses. They can survive technological eras. The evidence can wait for the future. And the future eventually arrived. But while the science was extraordinary, the emotional story was deeply personal. Teresa's mother, Betty, had waited for decades. By the time the case was solved, she was 84. That means she had spent most of her adult life knowing that her daughter had been murdered without knowing who had done it. Imagine the weight of that. 37 years is longer than an entire childhood. Longer than many marriages. Longer than many careers. Long enough for one generation to become another. And throughout all of it, Teresa's murder remained unresolved. When the answer finally came, it must have carried an almost unreal quality. The name of the man responsible. A name attached to someone who had already died. A name that had once belonged to an ordinary neighbor. A name that suddenly became inseparable from one of the darkest moments in the family's history. There is no perfect closure in that. There is only knowledge. And sometimes knowledge is all a cold case family can receive. The announcement also changed how investigators understood the original crime. Douglas's proximity to Teresa was no longer simply a geographical fact. It became part of the established history surrounding the case. The man lived behind her. He had been interviewed. And biological evidence ultimately connected him to the murder. The pieces fit in a way they never had before. Yet investigators still faced the limits of history. They could not recreate every moment. They could not know exactly what Teresa experienced. They could not ask Douglas to explain his actions. They could not determine every detail that might have emerged in a trial. The final story would always contain missing pieces. That is one of the cruel realities of solving a murder after the suspect's death. You can identify the killer, but you cannot interrogate him. You can establish responsibility, but you may never understand motive. You can tell a family who did it, but you cannot give them back the years they spent waiting. The science can answer the central question. It cannot answer every question. Still, the central question mattered. Who killed Teresa? Donald Douglas. After 37 years, that sentence could finally be spoken. And the importance of those words should not be underestimated. For a family, uncertainty can become its own form of suffering. Every stranger becomes a possibility. Every new detective creates another fragile hope. Every cold case article reopens the wound. Every anniversary raises the same question. Maybe this year they will know. For Teresa's family, that hope continued for decades. Then, finally, there was a result. Not because a witness suddenly remembered. Not because a confession appeared. Not because the suspect returned. Because the evidence was re-examined with modern science. That is the enduring lesson. Never assume that a cold case has nothing left to say. Sometimes the evidence has been speaking all along. We simply did not yet know how to listen. In 1986, investigators saw blood. In the modern era, investigators saw genetic information. In 1986, the unknown man was an unidentified biological sample. Decades later, he became part of a family tree. Then the family tree narrowed. A son provided a reference point, and the unknown man became Donald Douglas. The technology changed. The evidence did not. That is what makes the story so haunting. The answer had been physically present in the case for decades. It was not created in 2023. It was uncovered. The truth had been buried inside biological evidence. It simply required time, and patience, and science, and investigators willing to keep looking. There is another important detail. Donald Douglas's death did not erase the investigation. Some might assume that once a suspect dies, a case loses its purpose. But the opposite can be true. For the victim's family, knowing matters. For historical accuracy, knowing matters. For law enforcement, knowing matters. And for Teresa herself, there is something profoundly important about her name no longer being attached to an unidentified killer. Her case can now be described differently. Teresa Scalf was murdered in 1986. Her killer was eventually identified through forensic genetic genealogy. That statement closes a gap that had existed for nearly 4 decades. The gap between tragedy and truth. But there remains another gap. The gap between truth and justice. That gap cannot be completely closed. Douglas was dead. There could be no trial, no punishment, no sentence. The justice system could not impose consequences on a man who had already died. The only remaining consequence was exposure. His identity became public. His role in the murder became part of the historical record. The secret could no longer remain hidden. For a man who had lived decades without being publicly identified as Teresa's killer, that was the final reversal. He had escaped the criminal justice system during his lifetime, but he could not escape history. His name would forever be linked to Teresa Scalf. That is the legacy of a cold case solved after death. The suspect may escape prison. He may escape interrogation. He may escape a courtroom. But he does not necessarily escape the truth. And Teresa's story now belongs to that truth. A young nurse. A mother. A daughter. A woman whose life was cut short in her own home. A family that refused to forget her. A detective who kept her photograph close. A biological trace that survived. A family tree that reached across generations. And a name that emerged almost 40 years later. Donald Douglas. The case was solved. But the memory remained. Because cold cases are not only about catching killers. They're about recovering stories. Recovering names. Recovering truth. And sometimes, recovering the victim from the shadow of the crime. Teresa had spent decades being remembered as a murder victim. Now her story could be told with something else. An answer. Her family knew. Investigators knew. The public knew. The mystery was no longer open. The unknown blood had a source. The unidentified killer had an identity. And the case that once seemed destined to remain unresolved had finally reached its final chapter. But perhaps the most haunting image is not the laboratory, not the DNA report, not the family tree, not the announcement. It is the photograph of Teresa, a 29-year-old woman frozen in time, a woman who never saw the technology that eventually solved her murder. She never knew genetic genealogy would exist. She never knew investigators would one day search for her killer through distant relatives. She never knew her son's DNA could help establish the truth decades after her death. She never knew that the blood left behind would outlive the man who left it. But the evidence remained. And because it remained, the case remained alive. 37 years. One biological trace. One family tree. One name. One answer. Too late for Teresa. But not too late for the truth. And after all those years, that may be the most important thing the investigation could give her family. Not the past. The past could never be restored. But certainty. The certainty that the person responsible had finally been identified. The certainty that Teresa's case had not been forgotten. The certainty that the silence had not won. Because sometimes, the longest investigations are not the ones where detectives search the hardest. They are the ones where evidence simply waits for the world to become capable of understanding it. Teresa's evidence waited. And when the world finally caught up, it spoke with a voice no one could ignore. It spoke through DNA. It spoke through family. It spoke through history. And it finally gave Teresa Scalf the one thing her family had been waiting for since 1986. A name.